Somebody asked me a really interesting question. What is the strongest argument for young Earth creationism? And the reason they asked me that is because one of my beliefs is that we ought to do the opposite of straw manning, that is steel manning, which means that when we have somebody with an opposing position, or someone with a view or a belief that we find to be incorrect, we should give their position as much strength as is possible, because there's no point defeating there's no point defeating an argument by just simply demolishing the opponent's argument with the thing that does least justice to their position. And so I was asked it in that context, and I think it's quite an interesting question in that context, because it's what I find really strange about the position of the young Earth creationist. I find many things strange, but one of the surprising things, and this is something I've called the base rate narrative. It's kind of a fallacy, which I'll try to explain, because I think that gets to the heart of how we might be able to argue for at least why people like that stick to the beliefs that they do. Okay, so it's actually it's quite a peculiar thing that people exist whereby you can tell them a truthful proposition or point out that what they believe is wrong, and do so in a way that clearly makes them feel like their position has been undermined internally, that is, and yet they still would rather carry on believing something that's clearly wrong, and have no interest in changing their mind. Now, that in itself, it's quite a strange human phenomenon that we experience there, because for any number of reasons, it's in our interests to be right about things. The world is more interesting. We are safer. Having the truth about things is such a valuable quality that it ought to be quite surprising, I think, when people don't want to listen to it. So then you have to ask, well, what is driving this? And this is where I refer to what I call the base rate narrative. So I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. So when you hear socialists talk about rent controls, as in they want the prices of rents fixed, there are very obvious reasons why that's a bad idea, and not just in terms of the logic of economics. If you own a property, then it's maximally in your interests to rent it out at the price that the supply and demand signals have dictated that's the right price. And that could be, you've got your mortgage to pay, for example, maybe, or you want to know what kind of area the property is. What is the demand for the property? What are the other properties like in the area? What are the rental rates like in general compared with other parts of the city? What condition is it in? Is it on the first floor? Is it on the ground floor? All of these different factors and many more dictate the price of the rental sector. And it's maximally in your interests to charge the price that's most in accordance with your own interest, and of course the the tenants have the same incentives for them, and that's where the price equilibrium tends to play out. What are the chances that a politician whose interests are their own and their own popularity, their own vote winning proclivities, what are the chances that they know better than you how much that property should be rented out for? Absolute zero. What are the chances that whatever price they fix is the right price? It's bound to be too low or too high. If it's a rental fix, it's almost certainly going to be too low. So there's an underlying logic to why price fixing and also the empirical evidence is that every time rent controls has been tried in any city, it's always failed. And you can see why. I mean, not just the reasons that I said, but also let's say I don't know, local authorities get to choose the policies on rent. And let's say you're a property investor and you're going to invest in either Manchester or Liverpool. And let's say that Liverpool has a very liberal policy on rent and they leave it to the market mechanisms of supply and demand. And let's say that Manchester has a very socialist local authority that wants to fix the rents to beyond the marginal product. Now, where you have 50 million pounds worth of investment to invest in that in an area in the north east or northwest, where are you going to choose? The place that is undermining the probability that you'll get the maximum utility out of your investment, or the place that's fixing the prices? It's an absolute no-brainer. Now, of course, the reason that people would ignore all that evidence and still push for rent controls is because they're not interested in what's logical or true or factual or empirically verifiable. They're looking to push their careers forward and they have an agenda. So that's, and of course, rent controls are popular because most people don't really understand the basic economics. But you can learn all this. I mean, there are 25, 30 of these basic economic principles that you can learn in the first year of Econ 101. You know, it's really basic stuff. And similarly, I recall having a discussion with several people who were convinced that there's an unfair gender pay gap. And I explained all the reasons why. Firstly, the average pay of a man and a woman is not a very good measure at all of whether there's unfair discrimination at play. Averages are a bad way to discern unfair behavior. And of course, there are lots of reasons that you can factor in that show why, on average, over a career, men are getting paid more than women. And I've got a blog, I won't go into it now, but I've got at least one blog on that which explains it all. And also explains that even if you take all of those factors, all of those biasing factors into account, from the ages of, I think it's 18 to 39, women still out-earn men by about 1.1%, I think it was. So the people didn't want to listen to the arguments because they wanted to be convinced that there's an unfair gender pay gap, which is really a pay gap between the sexes. Gender's nothing to do with it. But that's what they want to believe, so it's almost impossible to convince them. So the point of all this is, it's quite interesting why people don't want to know the truth of a proposition when it's inconvenient to them. And this is, in large part, this is what's happening with Young Earth Creationism. You know, it's an absurd thing to believe, but when asked to say why I think it is that people believe it, in terms of trying to come to their defense, I mean, the belief system itself is indefensible at a scientific, at a theological, at an empirical sense of the word. But I can see why, because I've met people, quite a lot of people like this, who I can see why they want to cling to the base rate narrative of young Earth creationism. So the right question to ask when you try to analyze why people believe this stuff is, what is feeding their base rate narrative? What is the thing that really underpins, despite what they say, despite what the science indicates? And remember my illustration about hawks, pigeons, and sparrows. I think that's very important too, because I'm largely talking about the sparrows here, because the hawks are the people that are driving this agenda. The pigeons are sort of on board with them and trying their bits with blogs, and maybe they're quite influential in their church or whatever. But the main victims, and by far the largest group, are the sparrows, who just happen to accept young Earth creationism without really having the full grasp of why they do. And it's incredibly pernicious, and it's incredibly damaging to the church, to the reputation of the faith. It's a barrier to it's a barrier to entry for people who want to, explore the faith and think and ask questions about what we believe. But fundamentally, what the young Earth creationist is unable to do is understand the extent to which the world is assessed and engaged with through multiple lenses of reality. That's the fun. That's the driver of the base rate narrative. And there are lots of cultural and social and familial pressures as to why they would remain young Earth creationists. But what's driving it really is that they are unable to understand different ways that the world manifests itself in different levels and through different lenses of truth propositions. And the most obvious case in point here is that the Bible is clearly not only not a science book, but it was written in a time when it was so far previous to the standard science of Bacon, Galileo, Newton, people like that. And they are the precursors to the mainstream scientific paradigms that we are talking about in the modern era, of course. At the very most, you could argue that some rudimentary science began with the Greeks, and that's a fair point. But that's not how Scripture is written. It's not a scientific textbook at all. So when young Earth creationists try to distill what are effectively scientific facts by their reading of Scripture, what they're telling you is they are unable to distinguish between different types of truth in a multi-layered, highly complex, multi-lensed narrative structure and of course the Bible is a theological lens and a philosophical lens to some extent, but it's psychological, moral, but it taps into the the notion of storytelling and allegory and symbolism and moral instruction as the primary media through which God's love story is revealed. And these are people that wouldn't have had any concept of the kind of things that Young Earth Creationism is claiming for itself to be biblical facts and truths about creation science, as they call it, or how old the Earth is, or whether evolution happened, and all of this stuff. And literally everything you see that comes from that is a misunderstanding of the base rate narrative. Now, you might justifiably ask, why? And in their defense, what must it be like to believe this kind of stuff? And I think the provenance of it is quite easy to determine too. I would say I can see how it's ironically evolved over the last 150 years or so, especially in the last 30 or 40 and what have you, since it became harder and harder to deny the genetic relatedness of humans, since we know so much about genetics now. But you have to imagine what it's like for somebody who can't distinguish between different types of truth in this way. I mean, in fact, even that is a little unfair. I don't, it's not that they can't do it. Like, I think if you gave a young earth creationist a car manual with the instructions for how to replace a crankshaft, say, and you put it next to the poetry of William Wordsworth, I don't think they'd have very much trouble distinguishing the different lenses through which those pieces of work are being absorbed and being interpreted. I don't think they'd be utterly confused about the two different types of documents, but strangely, it isn't much of a difference, really, between the differences in their interpretations of the Bible as a scientific book and as a theological book. The difference is largely a matter of scale and complexity, but it's still the same kind of base rate error. It's reading the interpretive components and not putting them in the right category of truth. Biblical truth is very different, and there's some overlap, but it's rather different to scientific truth, which is very modern in comparison. And the problem with stories, of course, I don't mean that the Bible is all stories, obviously, but I mean the way that the early Genesis accounts and the way that those stories are nested in complex history and allegory and moral teaching and philosophy and theology. It's a body of text that's way, way, way more complex than just a merely literal interpretation of it. And because of which the subjects of the metaphysical components of faith, truth, justice, mercy, grace, forgiveness, redemption, restoration, all of these qualities, they're not just a fundamental part of the stories, but those stories are underpinned by those qualities in a higher order sense of the metaphysical. So that's the main error that the Young Earth Creationist makes. But then trying to be fair to them, just for a second, as per the questioner's request, if you're the sort of person who can't bring yourself to distinguish between the different types of lens of reality in this way, then you're probably the sort of person too who has lots of pressure from the hawks, from the pigeons to believe this stuff. And the reason you have this pressure, whether it's implicitly or explicitly or both, is because the people on the other side of creationism, the fundamentalists at the other extreme end, are making similar errors, and they're making similar errors in a way that kind of trivializes the faith and undermines it and ridicules it and dismisses it. And when that happens, what's most likely is that groups on the opposite side will get closer and closer, and then they may break up into other groups, like has happened with creationism quite a bit, but they will become more hermetically sealed because they'll feel threatened by what's going on, and it will reinforce the teachings within the group, and especially as they bring up their young, and that's happened to such an extent that now most sparrows who accept young Earth creationism just happen to go along with it because they think that's the theological norm, particularly in certain types of church. And the reason, because of the skeptic side of the argument, which is basically that it's sort of a creationism in reverse. It's like, well, if you take the Bible hyperliterally, then it's wrong about the science. Therefore, we'll reject the Bible and we'll be scientists, and we'll propound the wisdom that actually the only truth's worth having and the only way you can advance as a species is by becoming scientifically more astute and morally more humanistic and more egalitarian and democratic and all these different things that are shoehorned in to replace or supersede what they consider ancient superstition and a religious error. So now, obviously, that's wrong too. It doesn't get anywhere near the heart of the complexity. They're making the same mistakes as young Earth creationists are. But I think that at least that explains and gives at least a small degree of sympathy for what it must be like to be a young Earth creationist who is mired in this kind of impoverished worldview, whereby the orthodoxy of the particular church group, the umbrella groups, sort of assumes that you're going to be a young Earth creationist because that's what most of them are. And alongside that, the peddling of the narrative that if you're not a young Earth creationist, then you're entering into a more complex world where science and skepticism is looking to give God his redundancy notice. So from my experience, young Earth creationism kind of thinks of itself as the last bastion of the faithful. It's worried that if we keep, in their view, giving away things that are precious, then we're going to end up going along with the scientists and having no real need for God. But of course, that's not true in the slightest, obviously. But if you're the sort of person who can't distinguish between different types of lenses of reality, if you're the sort of person that can only look at some of the earlier books of the Old Testament, especially Genesis, and if you can't distinguish between different ways that truth is spoken into the world and revealed by theology, poetry, literature, science, philosophy, mathematics, logic. If you can't sort your lenses out, and you're the sort of person who could read Genesis and only arrive at the conclusion that that is explaining literal history and, to some extent, scientific truths about the order of how things were created biologically, materially, then it's not surprising that you are going to find it difficult to negotiate these subjects in a more complex environment, and also that you will retreat into a kind of safe enclave and just say, well, I'm not having anything else. That it's young earth creationism. That's what I believe. And I'm not going to go there because it will open so many doors that I don't want opened, that I'm going to have to just stay in my safe, uncritical space. And that's my experience of what's happened. It's for the sparrows, it's kind of a humble fault in a sense. I mean, the hawks and the pigeons, I think, are just, you know, the sparrows are the biggest victims of them in a sense. But so I can't make any case at all for the arguments in favor of young earth creationism. It doesn't hold up at all. And I can make some arguments for some things that I fundamentally disagree with. Um, I can I can at least see that if I thought this way, then this is how I might perceive the world to be, and I might talk about them on another late date. But no, the the only thing I can say, it's not a defense of young earth creationism because I think it's an absolute disgrace. But the only thing I can say to try to create the steelman equivalent on their side is that if you can't see the world in its full range of lenses and understand how those lenses of reality inform us about different levels and different kinds of truths, then you're unlikely to get everything out of both science and scripture that you need to. And that is why you're going to be a young earth creationist, I think. So, yeah, hopefully that's a helpful answer. Um, I did my best, and that's how I see it. Thank you for listening.